The most barbaric atrocities by colonizers in history. Atrocity number 1. The Bengal famine of 1943. The Bengal famine happened from 1943 to 1944 and was not the first of its kind to hit India. Before that, India had suffered several terrible famines in 1783, 1866, 1873, 1892, and 1897, and these were usually managed at the grassroots by local leaders who ensured that the communities had enough food in store in preparation for these famines. However, the advent of the British colonialists in India saw the centralization of such relief initiatives, as the British rulers wanted to have a hand in the affairs of the entire country. The British rule was plagued by life-threatening delays and bureaucracy. The British had a ruthless economic agenda when it came to operating in India, and they did not include empathy for the native citizens. They surely did a good job when it came to the massive exploitation of a country's resources at the expense of the natives. The British Empire had long justified itself by claiming to govern for the benefit of the colonized subjects. However, its conduct during the Bengal famine of 1943 gave the world a different picture of what Britain really was. In the years leading to the 1943 famine, most natives depended on subsistence foods and rice imported from Burma. But in 1943, when Japan conquered Burma, the rice import supply route was cut off, which exacerbated the famine in Bengal. It is reported that on hearing the Japanese conquest of Burma, the British assumed Bengal was next. So to render Bengal useless to the Japanese, the British destroyed the supply rice fields in the region. Famine scourged Bengal the way a predator feasts on a wounded prey. During this same period, offers by the Canadian and American governments to donate food aid were turned down by Sir Winston Churchill. We cannot tell whether it was out of malice, but his colonial government is reported to have refused the Indian ships from importing in foodstuffs, or even shipping food aid, whilst millions of Indian natives died of hunger. When the Indian government sent the Prime Minister a telegram informing him of the devastation and the millions of Indians that were dying, Churchill arrogantly replied, "If they're really dying, then why isn't Gandhi dying yet?" He further went ahead to blame them for their own deaths, saying, "That is why they breed like rabbits." At the end of the famine, at least 3 million Indians were reported to have died from hunger and starvation. Atrocity number 2. King Leopold of Belgium and Congo. In 1885, during the Berlin Conference, King Leopold of Belgium persuaded the other European colonial powers that he was the best man to run Congo. For those that have never heard of the Berlin Conference, it was a closed-door event organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, to end competition and conflict between European powers during the scramble for Africa. All this was meant to establish international guidelines for colonization. In a way, it was a gentleman's agreement. After securing Congo, Leopold set up a mercenaries group called Forces Publiques and turned it loose to rain terror upon the natives. Leopold turned Congo into a massive dystopian plantation and the Congolese into de facto slaves. From 1885 to 1908, the brutality unleashed by Leopold rivals and in some cases supersedes that of the world's worst tyrants. He ranks high up there with Hitler and Stalin. The natives were assigned work quarters of rubber, ivory, diamonds, and other goods to produce. And men who fell short of their quotas were mutilated by having their hands or feet mutilated by members of force publique. When a man escaped, well, it was deemed necessary that he could keep his hand or limbs to continue working. The king's goons would mutilate his family instead, amputating the hands of his wife and children. Millions of Congolese were mutilated for failure to meet these back-breaking production quotas. Millions others were murdered, starved, worked to death, or perished from various forms of mistreatment and misgovernment under Leopold's colonial regime. Multiple villages were burnt down, with all their inhabitants massacred for daring to protest against the colonial overlords. It was estimated that between 10 to 30 million Congolese were killed on Leopold's watch. These atrocities committed by Leopold in Congo, just to enrich himself, still send lightning bolts down many people's spines. Atrocity number 3. The French Setif massacre of 1945. During the Second World War, colonial powers conscripted men from their colonial territories to boost the size of their armies and fleets. For most of the natives from the colonial territories, this was a war they never consented to. It wasn't their war. Many African men were lost in a war whose goal and agenda was not clear to them. France, as a colonial master in Algeria, conscripted at least 200,000 Algerians to fight under their banner. However, due to their disorganized internal military command structures, they lost so many of these soldiers, of course including Algerians. To keep the war going, the French soldiers had to conscript and enlist new Algerian soldiers to back them up. And on May 18, 1945, when Germans surrendered and the war ended, the news reached back home in Algeria, and the natives were exceedingly happy, obviously, because their children, their husbands, their men were coming back home. Thousands of natives in the eastern Algerian town of Setif, including men, women, and children, marched towards the town to celebrate the good news. Also a part of this parade were the Algerian veterans who had recently returned from battle lines, the front lines. However, the French did not take this well. They thought this parade had a nationalist undertone because some of the natives had placards that read, "We want equality," "End the occupation," and others called for the release of Algerian political prisoners held by the colonial overlords. The French military commanded the marchers to ditch those placards. However, the marchers refused. The colonial police then opened fire on the marchers, and this led to more rage within the country. Riots broke out all over the country, followed by attacks on French settlers in the surrounding countryside, and it's estimated that about 100 of them were killed. When the news of what happened to the French settlers in Algeria reached Paris, General Charles de Gaulle, the head of government in metropolitan France, ordered the French colonial overlords in Algeria to restore order by all means possible. That meant that they were going all out in this massacre. This is all the French military needed to unleash their wrath as collective punishment. This entailed the indiscriminate use of heavy weapons of warfare against Algerian civilians. French battleships, cruisers opened fire on the native Algerian neighborhoods in Setif and its neighboring communities. French dive bombers struck and flattened over 40 Algerian villages. French soldiers wrecked over Algerian rural communities suspected of involvement in the unrest, in which thousands were shot in summary executions. French soldiers and settlers too went on a rampage in which they lynched Algerians seized from local jails. They shot many of them, they tortured many of them to death, and dosed many of them in fuel and set them on fire. Algerian men were frequently rounded up, forced to kneel before the French flag and then made them to shout, "We are dogs," before being led away and never to be seen again. The exact numbers are unknown, but it is estimated that between 20,000 to 45,000 Algerians were slain in this massacre. All these unfortunate situations could have been avoided if humans learned to live peacefully with one another and live with only what they had. But greed plagues the humankind, leading to war, oppression, atrocities that only the worst of beasts can commit. It is quite unfortunate that many of the people that perpetrated these crimes were never brought to book. It's just how the world is structured. Powerful people tend to evade the arms of justice. And as we say these days, it is what it is. And the only thing that we can do is to re-echo these atrocities so that the memories of the deceased live on forever. Did you learn something new in this video? Would you like to learn more about these and other related topics? Let us know in the comment section. Peace.